And we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze's Frontliner Interview. My name is Kimberly Hensle Lowrance, and I'm the co-host of Authors Love Bookstores, another program that broadcasts here on The Blaze. From time to time, I have the great honor of hosting Frontliner, and today is one of those days. I am delighted, so delighted to welcome our guest today, bestselling author Alice Hoffman. Welcome, Alice.
Hi, good to see you.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you. Now, I'm sure many of our viewers are like me and that they have an Alice Hoffman shelf in their house. But in case there are people watching who don't, if you'll indulge me just for a second, I'm going to share your bio. And I should say we're going to include a link to Alice's website where you can check out a much more extensive bio. But Alice Hoffman is the best-selling author of more than 30 works of fiction. Her first book was published when she was 21 years old, and she's been a beloved and distinguished storyteller ever since. Her books have received countless accolades. They've been Oprah Book Club picks and Reese Book Club picks. They've been made into movies. They're just well received and much loved. Alice publishes in a number of genres, including adult fiction, YA, and nonfiction. She's also been a screenwriter, and you can find her books in more than 100 foreign editions in 20 different languages. Her most recent novel is The Invisible Hour, which we're going to talk about today. How'd I do? Was that good bio? Was that a good summary?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
So congratulations on The Invisible Hour. This novel came out last month, and it's been an Indie Next Pick, a Book of the Month Club pick. It's been on a bunch of must-read lists, and there's been a lot of buzz from readers. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm not the only one. Stephen King loved it, too.
That was nice. That was very nice. Yeah, it's my first foray into time travel, which is, I've always loved novels about time travel, and I guess during COVID, I really wanted to time travel myself, so that's kind of when I started writing it.
Oh, that's so interesting that at a time when it felt like time was standing still, your response was to create a story where you could do whatever, where you could go wherever.
Yeah, I wish it had been true.
Can you tell our audience, the people who have not yet read The Invisible Hour, what the book is about? What's the story? And why did you want to write this now, other than like being in a different place and time traveling? Why this story?
Well, it's about a young girl who gets pregnant, and her parents make a decision for her. She doesn't want to go with the decision they make for her, and she runs away from home, and she gets involved with a cult. She doesn't really understand the depth of what she's doing. She has her child there, and she raises her little girl Mia in this cult. And one of the things about this cult, and I think I was very affected by what's happening with banning books all over and what's happening with libraries. One of the rules of this cult is that books are not allowed, reading's not allowed, you're not allowed to go to the library. But Mia's mother, whose name is Ivy, grew up going to the library. In fact, she grew up going to the Boston Athenaeum, which is a fabulous library. If you haven't been there, it's really worth a visit. And so she tells her stories, and that really changes her life. And then Mia finds a book that really changes her life. And I think that's probably true for most of us in one way or another. And the book she finds is The Scarlet Letter, which is a pretty amazing book, given that it came out in 1850, and it's really kind of a feminist book. You know, Hawthorne has said some weird things, but basically he grew up in a house of women, of strong women, two sisters, one of whom was brilliant. And he married Sophia Peabody, and she and her sisters were women who were very much interested in the arts and interested in things that women weren't really allowed to do at that point. So, and the other thing that I found out was that around 1850, up until about 1850, abortion was legal in this country, and up until a certain time. And then in 1850, the American Medical Association started to lobby the government to make it illegal. So all of these things were things I was thinking about when I was writing the book, and they all kind of came into play.
There's a great letter in the edition that I have. I think I have an advanced copy, and you write in here. It was a beautiful letter. There are many times reading this book where I felt like I was going to cry, and I thought your letter was one. The ending of this book is another. But you write in the letter, the books I fell in love with were always the ones that made me feel known, and they also changed my life. And I felt like that sentence, of course, so true for so many of us, as you just said, but I also felt like that one sentence describes this book, or like describes what is the theme of what's happening in this book, is a young woman falling in love with a book, feeling seen, and it changes the entire trajectory of her life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the great things that the Mighty Blaze is doing, is like talking about books, because for me, if I hadn't gone to the library, if I hadn't been a reader, I'd have a completely different life than the life that I have now. And I'm really aware of it. And I feel like so many times people who do things for you, like all of the librarians that I've known, really have no idea like how they've impacted you.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that, I think the relationship between readers and writers is a very intense one, and a very close one. And I feel like every time a book is read by somebody, it's a different book depending on who the reader is.
Absolutely. Has your relationship to your fans changed over the years through your books? Do you feel like
Yeah.
the way that they've received your books have perhaps it's changed yourself and your writing as well?
Absolutely. When I started out, I didn't tell anyone I was a writer. I don't know, there's something wrong with me, but no one, I would say I was a typist or whatever. I didn't tell anyone I was a writer for many, many years. And so it was kind of my secret life. And then it became unsecret, and I started to have, hear from my readers, and I realized, how important the writers were that I loved. And it was kind of the same thing going on. I mean, I would have never written another practical magic book if not my readers. I mean, it was their idea. And very often when people write to me, I mean, they have great ideas. And I also feel like I've met so many people, so many writers, so many readers, and it's just it's for me, it's a much fuller life as a writer, because as you spend so much time alone. And that's the thing I think I didn't really realize, when I wanted to be a writer. Being a reader and being alone is one thing. I don't know why, but being a writer and being alone can be really lonely.
Well, when you're a reader, you're falling into the world that the writers created,
Yeah,
right? And when you're a writer, you're creating that world, which is a lot of hard work.
it is hard work. Although I always think readers are also like partially creating the world, right? Because it's like their imagination. And
Right.
sometimes people will say to me, "Do you see a certain actor, like as playing a part?"
Right.
And I feel like I don't see the characters. I see through the characters.
Ooh. Oh, I like that. That's a great segue into my next question, which is, I loved Elizabeth. She's Nathaniel Hawthorne's sister,
Sister, yeah.
and I found her character so moving and so frustrating also, because she was this woman of immense potential at a time when she is limited by society and by the expectations of women, or the lack of expectations perhaps. And I wondered how she evolved for you. Was she, and maybe the same question applies to all the other characters, Ivy and Mia and Nathaniel and Joel, Sarah and Constance. Did those characters, were they present when you began writing, or did they evolve as the story came onto the page? What is your relationship with your characters, and how did
They,
how did they come to be?
yeah, those particular characters really evolved in my reading about Hawthorne's life, and also was lucky enough to be friendly with Megan Marshall, who wrote a beautiful book about the Peabody sisters, and who knew so much about the Hawthorne family. And so we had a lot of discussions and talked about his sister. That she's very interested in his sister, because at one point, I think at the beginning of his career, he publishes a magazine. But really, they both wrote it, only it couldn't be published under her name. And I just started to think about what that must have felt like for her. And I started to, I feel like, she's a novel in and of herself, but, the things that women couldn't do. And then, we were talking before we went on about the Old Manse out in Concord, where Hawthorne lived right after he was married to Sophia. And it had been in Emerson's family, and it's a great place to visit for people who haven't been there. But there had been a woman living there before they moved in, who was a tutor for Harvard students, but she couldn't go to Harvard.
Shirley Ripley.
Is that what I can't remember her name?
Oh,
Yes.
Oh, they told them.
She
I
was a brilliant woman, but she couldn't go to Harvard.
Yes, I should tell the audience that right before we began, I told Alice that after reading The Invisible Hour, I was inspired to visit the Old Manse in Concord. And it's amazing. If you're in the area, you should definitely go. But they talked about this woman. I think her name is Shirley Ripley. And she was like brilliant. She spoke Greek and Latin and Sanskrit and German and French. And she was all self-taught. And she stole or borrowed her brother's textbooks because she couldn't go to the university, and Harvard would send students to her when they were struggling, and she would teach
Right.
them.
I know. It's so fascinating that she could teach them, but she couldn't go.
And there is a book about her. It's called The Remarkable Mrs. Ripley.
And also Sophia, she was a painter. She was a pretty accomplished painter. But as soon as she was married, she couldn't sign a contract, so she couldn't sell her paintings. I mean, it's not that long ago, for women to have been in this situation. And so that was really interesting to me in thinking about who Elizabeth could be, and that all of their hopes were pinned on Nathaniel because he could succeed as a man.
So much pressure to be him,
Pressure.
and so frustrating to be her. There's this line, and she says to Mia something like, "Oh, things must be better in your time," and the irony is that they're not necessarily better. Like in some ways they are, but in other ways they're immensely frustrating.
And I think she's talking in that passage about abortion and about women's decisions to. Mia's mother, actually, it's the opposite. She doesn't want to have an abortion. She wants to have the baby, and her parents don't want her to. But it's just the idea of like women who can't make decisions about their own bodies. And there's this, Elizabeth's hoping that it's different in our time, and Mia says it's somewhat different, but not for everyone.
The relationship between Ivy and Mia was another part of the book that I really loved, and I thought it was very beautiful. This is a mother and daughter for our viewers who haven't yet read the book, and their love for one another made me think about my own relationship with my mom and my relationship with my daughter, and I thought that connection was really the heart of the book. And I wondered it was just beautiful, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about creating that dynamic between this mother and daughter, and how that came to you. Was that something that you knew you wanted to write about when you began writing this novel, or did it evolve?
I mean, I didn't know that that's what the book was about until I finished. You know how that is? Sometimes you don't know until the end, and sometimes you don't know even after the end. But for me, it really is a book about a mother and a daughter. And in I think the edition that you have, which is the arc, which there's, I tell a little bit about my relationship with my mother and how fraught it was. And she was she wasn't a very good mother, but she was a great friend. And she worked for the Department of Social Services, and I used to go with her to pick up babies to take them into foster care. And I didn't even really realize until I was writing this book how traumatic that had been for me.
Of course.
And it was really, it was very traumatic to take these babies away from their mothers and, be driving them around. And I think it's kind of the heart of the book, but I didn't really realize it because I think sometimes there's like an outside story and an inside story, and you don't know what the inside story is till you find it.
Do you outline your books? Or do you just begin to write chapter 1 and then keep going?
I used to not outline them, and then I was a screenwriter for 25 years, and I got used to I think I learned a lot from that, and so I do outline. I think it makes it easier in a way, but it always changes. So I outline with the thought that it can still always change.
Another part of this book that I loved, and I'm sure you've heard this before since you have written so many books, your writing is just beautiful. Like it's lush. The nature, the way nature and the environment is depicted in this book, it felt to me that the places that Mia lives are characters. There's one point I was reading the book and I thought, maybe I should go to the Berkshires this weekend and pick up some apples. There's that. Mia spends some time in Western Mass, in this cult, and as terrible as the cult is, she is outdoors and can appreciate just how gorgeous it is. There's bird imagery in here, beautiful use of lilacs. and other flowers. And I just felt like the places that she lived were alive.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I think so too. And I think that happens because I grew up on Long Island where everything was dead. So for me, nature is really important. And one of the things I did when I wrote this book that made it easier for me was kind of a little bit stuck in the beginning of it. And so I set it in the same town as another book I'd written had been set. And that was a town called Blackwell, Massachusetts. It was in a book called The Red Garden. And some of the characters are related to characters in that book.
Mhm.
And that like really helped me to begin.
Oh,
It gave me like a center.
Mhm. The other thing about this book is you definitely weave in the power of books and how much they can change lives, how much they changed Mia's life. She finds the Scarlet Letter and she opens it up and there's an inscription inside. And so she thinks this is like the first book she's ever seen. And she thinks that the book is for her. And that becomes a huge storyline. Her love of this book, her connection to Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I felt inspired to go reread the Scarlet Letter, which I had not read in many, many, many years.
Yeah.
And I remember not liking it as a teenager.
I didn't either.
And then I now view it so differently, which is fascinating to me. And there's a scene in the book when Hester Prynne has to go and argue to keep her daughter. For example, there's this sort of panel of men who are considering taking her daughter away. And she's this young woman. She has this daughter she loves so much. And there are these old, kind of cranky, gray-haired men who decide whether or not she can keep her daughter. And I read that, and it made me think, obviously, of The Invisible Hour and the story Ivy goes through about her daughter, but it also made me think about 2023 and how women still have to go before men who know nothing about their experiences and argue for what they believe in and what they want. And the connections between that book today and your book were so strong.
Thank you.
And I
thank you. There couldn't be anything I would want more, so I really
oh,
appreciate it. But don't you also feel like every time you read a book at a different period in your life, it's different depending on you and what's going on, and the book just
absolutely.
totally changes. I didn't like it either when I first read it, and
No?
I didn't like it. And then I read it again, and I realized it made me think a lot about my own personal situation because my
Mhm.
mother was divorced and she lived with someone without being married, and she was really an outcast. And I thought, oh, she's Hester, and it was just a very interesting thing to me that like nothing had really changed. And another thing that was interesting to me was that Hawthorne always felt he had this burden of his family because his family had one of his members of his family. I can't remember if his great grandfather or his grandfather had been a judge at the Salem witch trial.
Yes.
And that was a huge burden for him to carry. And I almost feel like the Scarlet Letter is kind of like an apology for that, for what his family did.
When did you decide that the Scarlet Letter was a book you wanted to incorporate into a book of your own? When was it something where you thought, oh, there's a powerful enough story here that I can link my world to it?
I don't know. It comes in kind of pieces, and for me, it's very subconscious and unconscious. But I think it really started quite a couple of years ago when I went to it's kind of an anniversary of Nathaniel Hawthorne's death, and they had kind of a mock funeral. So they had the carriage that he had been in, his coffin had been in, and we went to the set. We followed it to the cemetery, which is also like a great place to visit. It's a beautiful cemetery, and his grave is beautiful, and people leave tokens for him, and it's very moving. So I think when I did that, I thought I really want to write about him, but I didn't know exactly how that would happen.
When you think back to when you were a young girl, Mia's age, she starts off this book, she's 15 or 16. What was the book that you were reading at the time that you thought meant the world to you, that you connected with?
There were a couple of them, but the two that I think were affected me most, one was The Diary of Anne Frank, because I felt like I'd never in a minute ever thought about a girl, especially a Jewish girl, being a writer. Because, in my day, all we read were men in school.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a very important book for me. And the other book was anything by Ray Bradbury. and Fahrenheit 451, which is all about how important books are. And I've read that at different periods of my life, and it's helped me enormously. And I got to know him a little bit toward the end of his life, which I felt very lucky about, because I felt like he was kind of a moral center for me.
Mm.
And I just loved his books. And I think everyone who's like 12, 13, 14 should read Fahrenheit 451. I think it's a really, really important book.
What about time travel books? So this is your first time writing about time travel.
Yes.
Has there been a book that you read that featured time travel that you thought, oh,
Yes,
that's
there
it?
was. But well, first of all, the most recent one that I really loved is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig,
Yep.
and that came out during COVID, which was such a good time for it, because it's all about traveling to other possible lives that you might have had. It's really a fabulous book, and kind of very inspiring, and really good if you're depressed. So I highly recommend.
So your books are known for incorporating magic, many of your books. And this book has magic in it, obviously, if we have time travel. And I thought, I thought magic in many ways is a form of hope. Because I read this book, I thought, for Mia, it seems like this opportunity she gets to meet Nathaniel Hawthorne and connect with him felt so hopeful in response to a childhood that had been, well, missing out on a lot of hope.
Yeah.
And I wondered how you thought about magic and its role in your stories and in your writing.
Well, that's really interesting. I've never thought of it that way, but it's a really interesting way to think about it, because I always feel like when I'm writing a book, I'm writing it for myself to give myself hope in some way.
Mm.
So I think there is some kind of combination between magic and hope, that things are possible, that things can be beautiful, that you can take something terrible and transform it into something beautiful.
Another way that you have hope in your story is the library, and the library in Blackwell that Mia discovers. It saves her. And
Yes.
obviously, for so many of us, as we already have mentioned, libraries have been a place of healing and of finding ourselves. And oh, go ahead.
So much. And I often think that's why people want to ban books, because when you go to the library and you read books, one of the things it does is it gives you compassion for the way other people think or feel. It expands your world so much, so that if there are adults who want children to think in a certain way and only in that way, then I could see that books are dangerous, because they open up your mind. So they certainly did for me. I lived in a very kind of small world, and you know didn't really think very much beyond my world, and until I started to read.
I had a mother who would bring me to the library and just say, "See ya," and like let me go wherever I wanted to go. And those were the days when they didn't have a YA section. So then I found I was in the adult section reading stuff I shouldn't have been reading.
Isn't that great when you read everything you're not supposed to?
Yes. I read all the Stephen King until I had nightmares, right? Like that kind of a thing. And I was way too young for that. But it's interesting having children of my own. I do the same thing. Like, here you go. And we just need to talk about it. Like, why do you think this is complicated? Or why are you struggling with this? Or why do you think someone else might not want you to read it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real gift to give to your children. And I also remember having this feeling of freedom, just what you're talking about. Like, I can pick anything I want. I can do anything I want here. I can read anything I want, and that's a real gift. But I think there's too much to talk about it. But whether you talk about it or don't, I mean, I always felt like my mother and I read the same things, even when we weren't talking to each other. We had this connection through reading. She was a big reader, and I would steal books from her bookshelf. In my neighborhood, she was the only one I knew who had a bookshelf and who read books. So it was something that connected us, that we had in common. And I really love it when I meet mothers and daughters who both like share my books together.
Mm. Oh, that's so special. And then to talk about the books and see what different perspectives you bring to it and how you see the story differently, just as we talked about earlier. Oh, I love that. What are you reading now? Can you read fiction while you're writing fiction, or do you need to read nonfiction, or what's on your
It's
bedside
almost
table?
bad for me, because I was such a big reader, and I was the kind of person that always had a novel with me. I don't have that much time to read fiction and to read kind of what I want to read, because I'm always doing research. And So I'm reading a lot of historical nonfiction. And I don't even want to tell you what I'm reading now because it's for a book I'm writing and it sounds so terribly boring. But so I'm not reading as much fiction as I want to. I mean, I look forward to weekends when I can go away and take a novel with me.
Mm. You've been publishing novels and other forms of writing for decades. Your first book came out when you were 21. What would you tell yourself about your career if you could go back and talk to that debut novelist? What would you tell her about what
I can't really remember. I think I might have written it when I was 21 and it was published when I was 23. I had no expectations, and publishing was so different then. It was a lot less pressured, I think, than it is now. I mean, I think now for writers, there's different kinds of potential of self-publishing and smaller presses, but I think then there were so many different publishing companies.
Yeah.
And I for one, never expected to be published. I was just writing to write a story. And I never expected to be, a real writer or a professional writer to be published. I still think it's better to be a reader.
I still think it's better to be a reader.
Yeah, I do. I do, because there's nothing, you're just doing it for yourself, Being a published writer, there's a lot of other elements involved, and I think you have to kind of go back to that reader state and forget that there are other people out there. And, I do feel like I'm writing the book for myself. I'm writing the book, like you said, with, looking for hope, looking for an answer to some question. And sometimes I'm not even sure what the question is until I finish the book.
There's another show on the Blaze that I host, and that's usually the answer I ask authors is what is the question that you were trying to answer with this book? Because there is always a question. There is always something that the author is working through by telling the story.
And do they know? Do they always know what the question
Sometimes
is?
they know. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah, that's how it is for me too. I mean, I think a lot of times I'm writing in some way about survival for many different reasons. I am a breast cancer survivor, but even before that, I think I'm writing about, how do you survive in the world? How do you be brave in a world that feels so brutal?
Yeah. I am also a breast cancer survivor, which I never talk about on the Blaze, actually. And that was actually one of my questions. So nice segue, thank you. Was about all the advocacy work that you do on behalf of women and others with breast cancer. You have the center at Mount Auburn Hospital in Cambridge named after you, and you do a fundraiser to raise money for care and research. Why do you give back so much? Why is that important?
I feel like it's nothing compared to, what I got from the doctors and the technicians and from everybody who was working at Mount Auburn where I was treated. And at the time, they didn't have a breast center, so we worked hard over the last 25 years to build one. But also, every year we've been having an event at the ART Theater with writers, and writers have been so incredibly generous and have come and given their time. It's been a great experience to kind of. It's different than other events because it feels very personal because so many people there are survivors. And, it's just, and there are more and more survivors all the time, which is statistically, it's good for us.
It is good.
And, it's just, there's also so many people who don't get treatment or aren't able to get treatment. So we just want to kind of reach out more and more to those communities and to make sure that this hospital has everything that you would want to have if you went there as a patient.
To our audience, we're including links below to more information about Alice's philanthropy work. You also fund a prize for fiction with Plowshares. We'll include links below as well. So definitely a wonderful story about taking your success and helping others. It's really inspiring, Alice.
Thank you. I also have a program for teenagers at Adelphi University on Long Island, where I grew up.
Yeah.
Kids from the Bronx and Brooklyn and from Long Island and Queens come for free for a week to be with other teen writers. And mostly I do that with the education department there. And mostly it's because I wish that had existed when I was a teenager.
Yeah. That's how, you need someone along the way to believe in you.
Exactly.
So wonderful. Well, I know we're coming to the end of our time. Alice, I could talk to you forever, but thank you so much for giving us
It's so nice to talk to you.
Wonderful to talk to you. To our audience, thanks so much for being here today. Please check out the links below to pick up Alice's most recent book, The Invisible Hour, from bookshop.org, and also will include links to all of her other novels and her other work. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please join us back here next time on A Mighty Blaze for more of our interviews with amazing authors like Alice. Take care, everyone.